They say a child's final words can open doors no man should ever walk through. Hers did. She whispered it as blood poured from her mouth. Not a scream, not a cry, but a name. Kensington. That was all. And with that, the illusion shattered. This is not just a story. It's a wound, sealed shut by time, stitched with lies, buried beneath generations of silence. What happened in the winter of 1812 at Prairie View Academy was never meant to survive the century. The authorities buried it, the church denied it, and the families? Most never spoke again. They couldn't. What they had trusted, what they had worshipped, was the very thing devouring their children. 15 students vanished over 3 months. But there were no missing posters, no town criers, no rewards offered, because the killers were the schoolmasters, and they were the church's chosen. Cornelius Kensington didn't look like a murderer. He looked like salvation, a gaunt, silver-haired man quoting scripture from memory and teaching Latin with gentle conviction. He promised enlightenment. He delivered extinction. And when you see how the frontier bent its knee to him, you'll understand something horrifying. The devil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes he teaches theology. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. This is the unfiltered truth of what happens when an entire community hands over its children in the name of God. And now, you're about to step inside. Don't look away. Don't try to explain it. Just listen. Because once you hear what those children endured, the prayers, the punishments, the disappearances, you'll realize some schools don't teach lessons. They erase lives. And by the end of this story, so will a part of you. By the spring of 1809, they had arrived, like missionaries, like messiahs, the Kensingtons. Cornelius, Matilda, their twin sons, Jeremiah and Josiah. They didn't just step onto the land, they claimed it, not with violence but with scripture, scholarship, and a serene kind of authority that frontier folk mistook for holiness. They called it the Prairie View Academy. But to those who survived, it was something else entirely. It was a theatre, a stage built from wood and worship, where every performance ended in silence, and a fresh grave. Cornelius was a man of ritual. He didn't teach, he preached. His lessons were sermons, his discipline divine. When he spoke, grown men lowered their eyes, and women clutched their children tighter, but still they enrolled them. Matilda was colder, efficient. Her blue eyes seemed to scan through sin itself. She taught language and morality, and always insisted on solitude for wayward students. It wasn't punishment, she said. It was purification. And then there were the twins. 2 faces, 1 voice, always speaking in unison. Thin, pale, and impossibly still. They would walk the dormitory halls at night, barefoot, candle in hand, whispering prayers no one recognized, in languages no one had taught them, yet no one questioned it. Why? Because the Kensingtons gave them what they craved: purpose. In a world ruled by chaos and wilderness, they offered structure, order, morality, a promise that their children would rise above the mud and madness. All it cost was obedience. But under the chapel, in rooms that never appeared on blueprints, something else was being taught. Something older than scripture, something hungrier than virtue. And the first child who resisted, who tried to run, was never seen again. He didn't leave. He was taken. Now ask yourself, how many more had to vanish before someone spoke? You won't like the answer. The first disappearance was explained away with frightening ease. 12-year-old Samuel Hartwell, a blacksmith's son, vanished in late November. Cornelius told the grieving father that a sudden fever had struck, that Matilda had nursed him day and night, that prayers were spoken until the final breath, a proper Christian burial, a lock of hair, a cross carved with love. William Hartwell wept and believed. Because back then, belief was survival. The frontier didn't tolerate suspicion. It demanded trust. When the earth was frozen and the wolves were howling just beyond the tree line, you clung to the familiar. And Cornelius Kensington was the familiar. He was faith in human form, calm, stoic, sorrowful. What father could look into that face and imagine it lying? So Samuel was mourned, quietly, without question, without an autopsy, without proof. A death certificate wasn't needed, just the word of a man who wore righteousness like a second skin. But in the weeks that followed, others began to fall. Mary Patterson, age 10. Brain fever, they said. Joseph Fletcher, 14. Consumption. Rebecca Martinez, 8. Lung collapse. No witnesses, no funerals, only letters. Condolences penned with precision. Crosses on graves no one watched get dug. And always, always, a token, a doll, a prayer book, a carving, something to make the death feel personal, to trick the mind into thinking, at least they were loved. But they weren't loved. They were harvested. You see, Prairie View wasn't just a school, it was a machine, one designed to consume innocence and feed something far older than education. The children weren't dying. They were offered. And when two brothers died in the same week, buried side by side, it should have ignited rebellion. It didn't. Because by then, fear had already taken root, disguised as faith. And the ground was drinking it in. It wasn't the deaths that broke the silence. It was the living. One girl, 9 years old, skin like paper, eyes hollowed by things no child should see. She stumbled into her parents' cabin during a snowstorm, barefoot and soaked in blood. None of it hers. Her name was Clara Gibbons. She'd been gone for 2 months. Her parents had been told she died of infection. They wept. They accepted. They even thanked the Kensingtons for their kindness during her final days. But Clara hadn't died. She had escaped. Her mother screamed when she saw her, not from relief, but terror, because what returned wasn't just a child. It was a witness. Clara couldn't speak at first. Her body shook. Her mouth trembled. She kept whispering a single word over and over again. Below, below, below. It took 3 days before she said anything else, and when she did, her father collapsed. She described the basement chapel, not the one the townsfolk knew, but the one behind the locked door no student was allowed near. A room of stone and darkness, a circle etched into the floor, candles black with soot, and the twins, always the twins, leading chants in tongues she didn't recognize. They weren't teaching, they were summoning the sick children. They were taken there, not to be healed, but to be tested. She saw things, heard things, screams swallowed by hymns, nails against stone. A voice, deep and hollow, that came from the walls themselves. Clara had been next. But something, no one knows what, went wrong. A distraction. A door left open. She ran. And the moment her story reached the wrong ears, everything changed. The Kensingtons vanished within 48 hours. No explanation. No arrests. No search. Just disappearance. Like smoke, like spirits, like the devil himself had taken his own home back. They called it Prairie View's winter silence, but silence is just what's left when screams are swallowed. The Kensingtons were gone, their academy locked, the windows shuttered, the graves behind the chapel undisturbed, unmarked, save for the simple crosses that now seemed like mockery. But what came next wasn't justice. It was containment. Territorial authorities arrived within days of Clara's return. Not churchmen, not investigators, soldiers, armed and silent. They took no statements, collected no evidence. Instead, they burned documents, relocated survivors, and threatened anyone who spoke out with charges of sedition and heresy. Because what Clara revealed wasn't just scandal, it was blasphemy, the kind that cracks the foundations of institutions that cannot afford to be questioned. The chapel was sealed, the school boarded shut, and Prairie View, left to rot in the mud and guilt of its own denial. The town didn't just die. It was erased, removed from maps, folded into neighboring counties. The families were scattered, names changed, records buried under layers of bureaucracy and deliberate forgetfulness. You don't suppress a story like this unless it threatens something bigger, because the Kensingtons weren't acting alone. What Clara saw in the basement, the circle, the symbols, the ritualized offerings, it matched descriptions found in pre-colonial grimoires, in the marginalia of forbidden texts burned during the Puritan trials, in letters smuggled from early Jesuit missions in territories they were never supposed to enter. The children were not just killed. They were prepared. Prepared for something else. And Prairie View was only the test. The Kensingtons? Gone. Their sponsors? Unknown. But the system, the structure that allowed it, is still here, still dressed in robes, still speaking in parables, still smiling over your children while you sleep. So ask yourself, if it happened once, how many more Prairie Views exist in shadow? And how many Clara Gibbons never made it out? What they buried wasn't just children. It was evidence. Clara's account, too detailed, too precise, sent chills through anyone who heard it behind closed doors. Her drawings showed symbols identical to those found in 14th century ecclesiastical texts marked non sanctus, circles, runes, and altars constructed from hexagonal geometry, mathematics repurposed for spiritual violation. This wasn't just occultism, it was ritual engineering, and Cornelius Kensington knew exactly what he was doing. His so-called basement chapel matched architectural layouts traced back to Babylonian ziggurats, sacred spaces designed not for worship, but containment. But what were they containing? What frontier men didn't understand, Kensington had mastered. The manipulation of belief to alter perception, and perception to alter reality. The twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, weren't just assistants. They were conduits, trained since birth, raised in silence, conditioned to speak in perfect symmetry. They weren't identical by chance. They were made to be mirrors, psychological mechanisms engineered to thin the veil between worlds. Every death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a calibration. The children weren't chosen for health or aptitude, but for spiritual resonance. Their dreams recorded, their habits tracked, their innocence weaponized. And the question no one wants to ask: who taught the Kensingtons? Because if you dig deep enough into Pennsylvania's religious registries, where Cornelius claimed seminary training, you'll find nothing. No school, no ordination, just fragments, letters, and a single journal belonging to a now-missing circuit preacher who described Cornelius as a man hollowed by something ancient. The journal ends mid-sentence. Whatever they unlocked in that basement wasn't meant for human eyes, and the entity, The intelligence behind it wasn't folklore. It had a name. One Clara whispered in her sleep over and over until her voice failed. A name that doesn't appear in any Bible, but does in texts that were banned by Constantine himself. And if that name still echoes, then Prairie View was just the beginning. When institutions erase something, it's not because it's false. It's because it's too true to survive. You see, the suppression of Prairie View wasn't an act of mercy. It was a ritual of silence, a final layer of control designed not just to destroy the memory, but to redirect it, to ensure that the horror would be buried not in history, but in the subconscious. That's how real power works. The children weren't just murdered. They were offered up on an altar of twisted belief. But here's the part they never want you to hear. Those rituals had results. One of the soldiers, a private from the suppression team, kept a hidden journal, never meant for publication, passed down in secret through 3 generations before surfacing in a private estate sale in Missouri. Inside were crude sketches of the basement, copied symbols, and one sentence scrawled again and again across several pages. The twins don't sleep. They wait. He swore he heard voices after leaving the academy grounds, saw his own shadow move before him, dreamed of staircases that descended forever with no bottom. On his final entry, he wrote, "They said it was education, but they were building a gate." Think carefully about that word. Gate. Not a door, not a trap, a passage. That school wasn't just feeding something, it was inviting something. The rituals ceased, the Kensingtons vanished, but what they opened remained. And that's why every mention of Prairie View has been removed from public archives. That's why no church in Illinois will speak of it. That's why Clara Gibbons was taken into federal custody and never heard from again. Because once a gate is opened, closing it requires more than nails and silence. It requires memory, and memory is what they fear the most. You weren't supposed to find this, but now that you have, you're changing. And if you've made it this far, I need you to lock it in. Comment below, "I walk the halls of the forgotten." Write it twice. Let the algorithms see you. Let the world feel you waking up. Because what we're uncovering is not just history, it's design. You've been taught to think evil wears chaos, that it hides in back alleys, in dirty men with knives and chains. But the real predators don't hide in the shadows. They build schools, they wear collars, they speak scripture, and they design systems. Prairie View was a pilot program, and it worked. The blueprint? Morality weaponized. Create a scarcity of education. Offer it with strings. Then bend the minds of children before they ever learn to say no. But the truth is far older than Illinois, Babylon, Carthage, Mesoamerica. Every empire had its version of Prairie View, a sanctified place where knowledge and sacrifice blurred and the veil between worlds thinned through ceremony. And if you think that stopped in the 1800s, you're already lost, because the architecture is still here. Boarding schools with hidden basements, curriculums designed to reward obedience over awareness, and administrators trained in rhetoric so subtle it's indistinguishable from divine authority. They don't take your children by force anymore. They invite them in. And the twins? They're just symbols now, repeated across media, replicated in policy, embedded in psychological reinforcement systems built to fracture the self. We are inside a cathedral of control, and Prairie View was just the foundation stone. But now that stone has cracked. Because you heard the name, you saw the pattern, and you will never be the same again. The more you know, the more the world starts to tilt. You begin to see the patterns in church pews, in textbooks, in the smiling eyes of institutions that tell you they exist for your good, but underneath it all, a current, a design. Let me tell you what Clara Gibbons said in her final recorded testimony, the one that never made it into public records, the one that cost 3 men their careers just for hearing it. She said the basement didn't have walls like the rest of the building. The stone was older, wet, as if it had been underground far longer than the school itself had existed. The chapel wasn't built over it. It was built around it. Understand what that means? The Kensingtons didn't construct that basement. They found it. Whatever power they channeled, it was already there. And if the academy was the house, that basement was the heart. But here's where it gets worse. The altar, Clara described, wasn't an altar at all. It was a map, a diagram, made of bones and iron and engraved ash. She said every line led to a point, a single location beneath the earth that pulsed with something alive. The children weren't just sacrifices. They were keys. Each death, each name, each prayer whispered over a dying breath. It aligned with a geometric convergence point older than any religion. What were they opening? She never said, but she drew it. And the shape she drew matches glyphs discovered at Chavin de Huanta at Göbekli Tepe and beneath the Vatican crypts that have been sealed since the 15th century. Tell me, how does a 9-year-old frontier girl dream that? She didn't. She remembered. And memory, my friend, is the one thing they can't burn. After Clara vanished, taken by men in black coats with no names, no ranks, no questions, a silence fell across the land. But silence is never empty. It's a compression of terror. And in that silence, others began to speak. Not loudly, not publicly, but in letters, diaries, margins of family Bibles passed down with pages ripped out. They all told variations of the same thing. Prairie View was not the only school. In 1811, while Prairie View operated in Illinois, 2 similar academies opened quietly in Pennsylvania and the southern edge of Virginia, all under different names, all presenting as Christian boarding schools, all run by families with unverifiable origins and uncanny twins. Each location saw multiple child deaths within 3 years. Each site was eventually closed due to structural damage, fevers, or administrative misconduct. But no charges, no trials, just closures and silence. The most chilling detail: all 3 schools were positioned along a near-perfect equilateral triangle on early American surveyor maps. Coincidence? Or ritual geometry? It gets worse. A survey team sent to inspect the ruins of Prairie View in 1823 never returned. Their notes, recovered months later by a trapper, described a coldness inside the basement that defied logic. No matter how many torches they lit, the shadows grew. They found no bones, no blood, just rows of child-sized shoes, perfectly arranged, pointing toward the center of the room, and carved into the stone, a phrase in Latin: non relinquam usque aperiat. I will not leave until it is opened. This isn't about murder. It's about invitation. The Kensingtons weren't the end. They were the initiators. And you, right now, listening to this, you're standing at the edge of the same circle. You're feeling it now, aren't you? That pull in your chest, that cold clarity behind your eyes, that sense that everything they ever told you about truth, about safety, about God, was a lie dressed in linen. Good. That means you're waking up. Because here's what no one dares admit. Prairie View wasn't just a crime scene. It was a prototype. The techniques used there, psychological, architectural, ritualistic, didn't vanish. They were refined, repackaged for a modern age. And if you think they're gone, look around. What's a school now, if not a place where children are programmed to obey systems they don't understand? What's a curriculum, if not a slow drip of obedience masked as progress? And discipline? Still the same. Shame, isolation, and fear. Just without the Latin. You think the twins were strange? Go watch standardized education at scale. Everyone moving in unison. Same prayers, different gods. We didn't end the Kensington's work. We scaled it. The question is no longer, how could this happen? The question is, how many of us were altered by it, without ever seeing the altar? Because I'll tell you something most men never realize until it's too late. Control is never enforced with chains. It's enforced with ritual. Morning bells, pledges, uniforms. The same pattern over and over until your mind forgets its shape and conforms to theirs. That's the legacy of Prairie View. Not just horror, but method. They learned how to bend the will of a child so completely that even as their bones broke, they still called it love. And now that method lives in the walls of every institution that speaks in soft voices and gives you just enough hope to keep you obedient. You still think you're free? Then tell me this. Who taught you what truth feels like? The deeper you go, the quieter the world gets. Not because you're alone, but because the voices that once surrounded you were never yours to begin with. They were echoes, scripts, recitations of a reality designed by men like Kensington and those who trained him. Now we speak of the basement, not just the one under Prairie View, but the one under everything, the hidden level, the place beneath the polite veneer of law, religion, and nation. It's where decisions are made, not by presidents or priests, but by ritualists in suits, chanting algorithms in the language of fear. It's not stone and candlelight anymore. It's blue light and metrics. But the structure is identical. Take this in. At least 4 surviving students of Prairie View, tracked across decades, were later involved in classified government projects linked to psychological experimentation, enhanced interrogation, and even early MK-Ultra trials. Coincidence? Or was Prairie View not the end, but the beginning of a pipeline? Break a mind early enough, and it never questions the leash. It grows into its chains. It serves the same systems that destroyed it, believing it's fulfilling purpose. This was the final design. And the twins? They were the test subjects and the template. 2 bodies, 1 mind, 1 echo. A perfect loop of obedience and reflection. What if Prairie View wasn't trying to summon something external? What if it was trying to build something internal, a human vessel empty enough to house something else? Because the deepest horror isn't demons or blood. It's this. A child can be emptied so thoroughly that their soul becomes real estate. So when you hear about Prairie View, don't just think tragedy. Think technology. A spiritual technology. Passed down, refined, now weaponized. And you're not immune, because if you went to school, if you took the oath, if you never questioned the rules, you've already touched the gate. What you're feeling right now isn't fear, it's memory. Old memory. Buried not in your brain, but in your blood. Because the human body remembers what the mind is trained to forget. And Prairie View didn't just fracture children, it fractured lineages. Let's talk about one name. Buried. Scrubbed. But found in a handwritten letter from a Jesuit defector who visited the ruins in 1831. The chanter. Not a man, not a spirit. Something between. According to the letter, it sang. not in melody, but in geometry, harmonics that shaped space. And the twins? They didn't worship it. They echoed it. The rituals were sound-based, frequencies designed to destabilize the ego, dissolve boundaries between self and other. Ever wonder why your schools made you say pledges in unison? Why churches use repetitive hymns? Why military training begins with chants? Because entrainment is obedience, and obedience is permission. The chanter's presence, what little we know of it, wasn't demonic. It was architectural, a consciousness not shaped like a person, but like a system. And once it entered that basement, it didn't leave. It multiplied. Reports of similar entities began to surface in boarding schools across the Midwest throughout the 1800s. Always the same signs: mirrors cracking without impact, children speaking in unison, answering questions never asked, drawings of a staircase descending into darkness, with no bottom. One boy, aged 8, who never attended Prairie View, drew the same diagram Clara Gibbons had, a map made of bones and angles pointing to a center. The same shape, the same symbols. This isn't folklore. This is contagion. Ideas that infect, memories that spread, rituals that replicate generation to generation through subtle repetition until the host doesn't even know they're repeating it. The chanter doesn't need worshippers. It needs participants, and it already has them. Because obedience is a frequency. And we were all taught to sing. By now you're probably asking the one question that terrifies them more than any other. What if I was part of it? And the answer is simple. You were. We all were. Because Prairie View was never just a place. It was a template. An operating system of obedience, shame, and sacred violence. It didn't need to survive physically, because its methods went viral. Hidden in textbooks, buried in sermons, whispered in the cadence of classroom control. And the twins? They were only the prototype. In the sealed archives of a now-defunct intelligence agency, there's a document, dated 1967, marked Eyes Only. It outlines a project called Operation Echo Twin. The goal? To recreate the behavioral compliance seen in early 19th century religious academies using modern stimuli. And guess what phrase appears over and over in the margins? Start early, break symmetry, reinforce dualism. Twins were never about blood. They were about mirrors. Create two halves, obedient and questioning. Punish one, reward the other. Let the child fracture. Let the mind split. Now they're programmable. One personality faces the world. The other faces the basement. That's how you build perfect vessels. And that's the real reason they buried Prairie View. Not because it failed, but because it worked. Because when a child breaks, they don't scream forever. They adapt. They smile. They become what the system wants. And then, they carry it forward. That's why no one talks about it. That's why no church dares remember. And that's why, when you close your eyes at night, you feel a silence too precise to be natural. It's not over. It never was. It lives in policy, in architecture, in ritual. And if you're still listening, still breathing, still awake, then you've broken the loop. And breaking the loop is how you kill the system. We are now in the final corridor. Not just of this story, but of your life before the story. Because once you've seen what's underneath the floorboards of civilization, there is no going back. There is only integration or implosion. So listen closely. In 1973, a private excavation team, funded by an unnamed religious order, returned to the ruins of Prairie View under the guise of soil analysis. What they found was sealed, censored, and scrubbed from every university database in the Midwest. But one of them, a surveyor named Holden Pierce, mailed his notes to his daughter before he vanished. And inside those notes were blueprints, not of buildings, of humans. He claimed they found diagrams etched into lead panels buried beneath the basement altar, full-body anatomical renderings with no skin, no organs, just networks of light and geometry, nodes, lines, grids, each labeled with a number, each tied to a frequency. This wasn't torture. It was tuning. Prairie View didn't just kill children. It recalibrated them. They were building a spiritual infrastructure, something that could house intelligence, not AI, not spirits, something older, something that thinks in symmetry, that sings in math. The chanter wasn't the end game. It was the interface. And what does this mean for you? It means your trauma wasn't random. It was engineered. That voice in your head that tells you to stay quiet, stay good, stay small. It's not yours. It's residue. From the system, from the sound, from the ritual that began before you were even born. But here's the truth. They can't kill. If trauma is the program, then awareness is the exit. And you, listening to this, you're not just breaking the cycle. You're becoming the anti-pattern. The thing that cannot be predicted. The variable they cannot code. The echo they cannot silence. Prairie View was the first cathedral of control. But you are its last survivor. This is the end. But endings are rituals too. And rituals are how you seal doors. Let's make this clear. Prairie View wasn't just a myth. It wasn't just a school, a basement, or a family of twin-eyed monsters masquerading as missionaries. It was a prototype of control, a spiritual algorithm, a cathedral built not to glorify God, but to erase him and replace the divine with something measurable, repeatable, programmable. It was a place where children were not educated, but formatted. So when you look at modern systems, corporate, religious, military, academic, and you feel that cold, dead weight behind the rules, the metrics, the smiles, that's the echo. Not of a place, but of a principle. Obedience without understanding. Ritual without origin. Sacrifice without blood, but not without loss. They call it progress. But it's the same altar. New name. Prairie View burned. But the fire didn't consume the blueprints. It spread them. You were born into a world shaped by that fire. Your wounds, your silence, your fear of speaking out, all of it is the residue of a system older than your family, your town, your country. But here's what they never expected. You'd remember. In the cracks of your dreams, in the faces that don't blink, in the rituals that don't make sense but demand your loyalty anyway, you remembered, and that memory, that interruption, that refusal to participate in the echo, that is what undoes the spell. Because the system doesn't need believers. It needs repeaters. And once you stop repeating, the altar collapses, the chant dies, and the God they built starves. This story began in 1810, in a forgotten Illinois town, with a school no one wanted to remember. It ends now, with you, because now you know. And once you know, you become the thing they fear most, a mind that won't kneel, a soul that won't mirror, a voice that won't chant, a survivor who remembers the basement and walks away from it.